Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Could you hear me? Great. Tonight, Yehuda and I, we want to speak about us. Us, and the bigger us. We want to speak about the Jewish people. In particular, we want to speak about the relationship between Israel and North American Jewry, and North American Jewry and Israel. There's an increasing sense that not only are we two ships sailing in opposite directions, but that maybe we're even in just different oceans altogether. Now, one of the deepest commitments of this institution, as many of our board members here know, is that on our watch, the Jewish people aren't going to walk away from each other. And on our watch, the Jewish people in Israel aren't going to turn their backs on world Jewry, and world Jewry is not going to turn its back on Israel. And a huge, huge percentage of our work is to do everything in our power to avoid that consequence. And for us, it seems simply inconceivable that a Jewish people could only be united in a time of horrific anti-Semitism. That Jewish peoplehood is alive and well when people hate us and threaten our existence. That we, the Jews who are more blessed than any Jew in Jewish history, can't marshal our resources to find a way to actually want to be with each other without needing some enemy on the outside to coerce us to have a relationship with each other. There's something diseased about that. And for a Jewish people who could do anything, as we often say in the Institute, there is no shortage of resources, there's only a shortage of vision. So what is it? What is the vision that we need to put on the table? How do we understand? What are the problems we face? And there are real problems. And what are some of the ways that we could begin to rethink about this notion of Jewish peoplehood? How is it sustained? How do we understand each other, and how do we build a relationship with each other? In my remarks, I want to speak from Israel's perspective. I want to speak about how Israelis think about you. What do we think about you? How do we make sense of you? Or how are we not understanding you and not making sense of you? Now, after the Kotel and after a conversion law, both of which I'm not going to speak about tonight, I'm going to speak about more on Wednesday. After an increased sense of separation and a lack of ability to speak about issues of occupation, there is a growing argument that Israelis fundamentally don't care about you. Israelis want your support. Israelis want your money. Israelis basically want you to shut up. Now, that's not the foundation of a healthy relationship. Someone might even posit if they really want you to shut up, they don't see you, they don't care you. You are an instrument. You are not an other who Israelis believe they have to have a relationship with. For what other reason could there be if North American and world Jewry say, I care about this, and Israelis fundamentally don't care when your feelings are hurt, don't feel necessarily that they have to take you into account, even though that's not true? Have Israelis given up on the idea of Jewish peoplehood? Now, one of the arguments would be, or proofs, is the fact that there is no word for Jewish peoplehood in Hebrew. Now, technically, there is a word, but nobody knows it. It's a word which about 46 people If there's an Israeli in the audience, it'll go up to 47 tonight. Know it. The technical term is amiyut. You'll never hear it. Nobody knows the term. If there isn't a term for Jewish people, it is because they don't care. I want to argue tonight that that is a fundamental misunderstanding of Israeli society. Israeli society, in fact, all of Zionism is built on this idea of Jewish peoplehood. However, the challenge is that Israelis don't have categories to either see or take you into account. Particularly, not you as world Jewry, but you as Jews who live in the United States and Canada in particular. The whole Zionist enterprise is the Jewish Peoplehood's project. The Declaration of Independence begins with, in the land of Israel, the Jewish people were formed. And over again, the term Jewish peoplehood gets repeated in the Declaration of Independence. And in Clause 10, the famous Clause 10, where it speaks about the inalienable right of the Jewish people to sovereignty, it doesn't say that Israel has a right to be free. It says that the Jewish people have an inalienable right to sovereignty. And it is by virtue of the Jewish people's right that Israel has a right and comes into existence. There is no Zionism. There is no state of Israel separate from its connection to the Jewish people and its self-understanding as a homeland of the Jewish people. So if that's the case, what's going on? First, it's important to put on the books or on the record that Israelis have a very, very deep, deep connection and a deep sense of responsibility to Jews around the world. In fact, even to this very day, they see Israel as a Jewish peoplehood project. The challenge is that this Jewish peoplehood project gets expressed in two central dimensions. The first, which shouldn't be belittled, is that every Israeli believes that this country belongs to you if you choose to move here. Now again, that's no small little thing. Israelis say, I'm here. I will fight for this country. I will die for this country. I will send my children to fight and die for this country. And whenever you want, at any time, under any condition, if you so desire, you have a right to come here. I will keep it for you. I will watch it for you. I will come at a time when there are no phones, when there is no food, when our army isn't that powerful, when our economy stinks, where there are no jobs, where we have hyperinflation. It doesn't matter. I will watch it. I am here. But I am here holding something that belongs to you. And Ben-Gurion stands up in front of the Knesset and says, all those who claim that the law of return discriminates between Jews and non-Jews and citizenship, says, you don't understand. I don't feel that I am allowing Jews to come here. This country belongs to them. I am merely distributing to them a citizenship to which they already have a right. Now you tell me where, it doesn't matter. You could be gone for 2,000 years. As an American, after one generation, my grandchildren don't get automatic citizenship. Israel says, no matter how long, no matter if you were never here. Now it's great to come here. We have health care that works. I don't care what age you are, come. It's yours. And I also don't care, and I want to speak about this more on Wednesday, I also don't care what denomination you belong to. And I don't care who converted you. Israel's law of return has the most expansive definition of Jewishness of any Jewish community in Jewish history. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. What do we do with the rabbinate? That's something for Wednesday. Come. If you have one Jewish grandparent, come. And I don't care if 1 million of you have to come. I don't care if I have 2.5, 3 million Jews, 1 million of you come. If it's like 70 million people coming to the United States in a period of 10 years, come home, it's yours. Is that not an act of love and commitment to Jewish peoplehood? If that's not, then I don't know what is. We're here watching it for you. When you want to, it will be here forever as your right by definition. That another people takes its land, its resources, its country, and is willing to, by definition, share it with somebody who hasn't contributed to it, hasn't spilled their blood for it, comes at a time when it's more convenient, that is the first core expression of Jewish peoplehood in Israel. And every Israeli feels it. Doesn't mean they're always happy about it. It's true, Israelis love Aliyah more than they love Olim. There's all these different issues that they get ambivalent, but still, that's a core principle of this country's self-understanding. The second core principle is the belief that the dividends of Jewish power do not belong to Israelis alone. The dividends of Jewish power are shared by Israel with Jews around the world. Every year, the chief of staff of the Israeli army gets up and goes and gives a speech in Auschwitz in the March of the Living, and he says, we do not have an IDF in Israel. We do not have an Israeli defense force. We have a Jewish People's Defense Force. And when he declares never again, he says that if a Jew is in danger anywhere in the world, I, the state of Israel, Israel's army, whatever resources we have are at your disposal, by definition. And the definition there is, if you are attacked for being a Jew, no rabbi's going to get up and wonder and say, 1 second, where was their conversion? Was this a Reform shul in Houston? Or were these Reform Jews in Charlottesville? No one asks those questions. If you're attacked for being a Jew, Israel sees itself as responsible. So if this is so deep in Israeli society, why is there a feeling of callousness? Why is there a feeling of lack of respect? Herein lies the problem. Israelis have a deep sense of a commitment to Jewish peoplehood, to Jews who might want to move here or who might need to move here. They are willing to share the dividends of their power, but they have no category to deal with Jews who don't want to make Aliyah and who don't need access to their power. Fundamentally, in the Zionist narrative, you were never supposed to be. In the Zionist narrative, history is divided into two: Holocaust and rebirth. Anybody not living in Israel is in destruction, is in Holocaust. Israel is rebirth. The state of Israel is formed under the belief that Jewish life outside of Israel is incoherent. It is imperpetuatable, if there is such a word, or imperpetuable, or whatever. Can't be perpetuated. It's not viable. Jews will never be safe in Christian Europe. And if Jews are going to live, they will only live in their own sovereign country. There is Holocaust, which is not just a Holocaust of the 30s and 40s. It is the fundamental reality of any Jew who chooses to live outside of sovereignty. And there is rebirth. And that rebirth is in the land of Israel. Now, what happens when there is a Jewish community who, just like the Zionists, also believe that there is no future to Jewish life outside of Israel? There's no future to Jewish life in Christian Europe, but who define rebirth not by moving to Israel, but define rebirth by moving to the United States and Canada. Very deep in North American Jewish consciousness is an anti-Zionist narrative. Not a narrative which doesn't want to have a relationship with Israel. Not a narrative that doesn't care about Israel. but a narrative from Israelis' perspective that doesn't accept the notion that any existence outside of Israel is fundamentally incoherent. That existence outside of the land of Israel is not going to lead to another Holocaust. So deep, deep in the Zionist narrative, there is this term called Shlilat HaGolah, denying the value of diasporic life, but that doesn't mean that it's denying the notion of Jewish peoplehood. It just believes that it is only here. All Jews must come here. This is where you're going to be safe. This is where you're going to be able to flourish. This is where you're going to be strong, physically, emotionally, and religiously in your identities. It's for that reason that if you remember Charlottesville, many people wanted to know why Netanyahu did not critique and come out and condemn Charlottesville. Part of that is also because we now live in an era that no matter what organization you are a part of, you have to critique something. If you don't critique on Twitter something every day, somehow you're going to lose your whole donor pool. It's like, I exist, I have to be, I have to this, I have to make, what's your position? Everybody has to have a position every 15 minutes and commenting on each other. So why did an Israel tweet its position? Netanyahu didn't do it because he was afraid of Trump. Narishkeit. Do you know why Israel doesn't condemn Charlottesville? Because when it sees not Charlottesville, guess what it sees? What should be? You think you're going to live in America and not have Charlottesville? Charlottesville is the new normal. You are just deluding yourself. What's my response as a Zionist to Charlottesville? Come here. I'm waiting. You want me to condemn Charlottesville? I don't fight anti-Semitism outside of Israel, because anti-Semitism outside of Israel is what life outside of Israel is about. You thought you were different from France? You're not different from France. Even in a perverse way, we even enjoy Charlottesville, because everybody loves the opportunity to say, I told you so. I told you. Where do we move forward? And I want to put on the table a simple idea, which is part of the way I am hoping, and this institution, it's part of a major initiative that we're engaging here. It's called, you all know the program of I Engage Israel. We're doing I Engage America, a similar type program, and Canada. I'm being really politically correct here, I know. And I Engage North America, on how do we enable Israelis to rethink the core ideas of their relationship with world Jewry. Just like we want North American Jews to think about their relationship with Israel, we need a similar project for Israeli society, and we're in the midst of engaging in that. I want to share, though, one idea that has emerged from our research. And our was not a rabbi using the royal we. Our is the product of a research team who has shaped mine and Yehuda's thinking over the last 8 years. A remarkable team. The Israeli notion is that we are the homeland of the Jewish people. And as a home, where does a family belong? At home. We're the home. But in fact, if you think about this, there is a fundamental flaw and mistake in that notion that a family belongs at home. Because most families don't have a home. Families only have a home when the children are small. When the children get older and become more mature, families, in fact, have multiple homes. I have 3 homes and a room in Tel Aviv. And it's not just because I pay the mortgage for the 2 homes and I also pay the rent. In fact, when I go to my children's home, I'm at home. I am at home. In a different sense. But I'm not in a stranger's home. I'm not in a hotel room, and I'm not a guest somewhere. In my little tribe's real estate empire, There is a very complex relationship that we have in each other's homes. I want to talk about that for a few moments. Because if we understand that, there is a Derech Eretz, if we use our theme, there is a Derech Eretz of these homes, of these multiple homes. And it's not just the source that we studied together that a person shouldn't stay at his cousin's house for more than a month. There is a very fascinating nuance in the way we learn how to live with each other and share each other's homes. So, for example, I have a key to my children's homes. And my children have a key to my home. But there's a very interesting difference about the keys. My key, the key that I have, is not a key to use. Most of the time. The key that I have is to hold the key in case they lose their keys. That's why I have a key. We have the key drawer. The job of the key drawer is not for me to go to their home, it's for me to hold the key for their home in case they lose a key, don't know, mommy, abba, he, she took the key. Do you have my key? Now, I could go there from time to time, uninvited, but not often. If you go often, they'll change the key. And they'll find that their neighbor could also have a drawer for their keys. But you have a key. And when I go to their home, by the way, most of the time it's true, it's invited. When I sit in my children's living room, I'm at home. Not as much a home as my home, but it is part of my home. I could put my feet up on the couch. I could get something to drink. I don't have to ask permission. I could go into the refrigerator, but there it's interesting. I could go into the refrigerator, but I have to look at what day of the week it is. Like, for example, on a Thursday night, and before Shabbos, or if food is prepared and cooked, I could eat a fruit. But I don't eat something cooked, because maybe it's needed. I could ask, and then the ritual is, my daughter says, of course you can. But they'll also say, maybe you can't. Also, I wash my dishes. But I'm able to relax. I feel very, very much at home. My children have a very different relationship with my home. They have a key. It's to be used at will. Part of the whole idea of the key is that the definition of their maintaining their relationship with our home is to come uninvited. If you ever try to change those rules, you're violating a core code and a core sense that this is my home. Not only do they have a right to come whenever they want, truth be told, now that they have grandchildren, we actually want them to come uninvited. Like we put on a face, but actually this is a good thing for the Jews. We want them to come. You saw my grandson the other. I have 3 grandchildren. Each one of them is, it's just unbelievable. They come uninvited. As distinct from their home, they still have a notion in my house of their room. Do any of you remember the time you redecorated their room? They're not home. They come twice. Now in Israel, they actually come often. But they don't live there. They have another place. No. They need a closet, a drawer, a shelf. They need a marking. And here, please remember, they need a symbol. Just like when I go into their home and I sit on the couch, they want some symbolic reference to the fact that it's still their house. And if you change their room, how dare you change? The trauma, you redesigned my room. You gave my room to somebody. They all have space. Why do they keep space? Why do they keep stuff in my house? It's not because they need to keep stuff. It's because a way for them to represent that it's their home. They go into the refrigerator and eat whatever they want, whenever they want. Doesn't matter. Because mommy and Abba, of course it's I'm a child in a certain sense. There are, however, rules. They don't take out a mortgage on my house. It's their home, but they don't take out a mortgage. They don't move around the furniture. They don't do a redesign of the space. They also, and this is one of the most important rules of Derech Eretz, even though we're in each other's homes, I don't go into my daughter or sons or daughters, or they don't go to our house and say, ugh, it stinks here. You don't dump on someone else's. They do a little bit more than we do. But it's true, truth be told. Ugh, Mami Naba, what did you do? I hate the furniture. Oh, your house looks beautiful. It's so clean. It's wonderful. Could I wash the dishes? You know, there's a way in which, why am I telling you this story? Because when they were little, life is great. Parents, it's phenomenal when your kids are little. You actually think you're king. You get to decide they follow your rules. As children grow up, they leave your house and you want them to it. It's an inherent part of their personal growth. But there still is a family relationship, not just a relationship to each other, but a relationship to each other's space. And a major part of the relationship to each other's space is symbolic. That you want to know that you still remember that we're family, that I have a place here. Part of our challenge is those same Israelis who love you, those same Israelis who care for you, are they able to recognize that while this is the homeland of the Jewish people, it's not the only homeland of the Jewish people? Israelis see you as children. Could they see you as adults? Maybe they think that Israel's better than where you live. Maybe that's inherent to Zionism. Zionism will always have difficulty accepting complete parity. Israel's not a home and you have a home. Maybe give Israelis the feeling that this is a better home, but it doesn't matter. Is it also in some sense yours, even though you no longer live here, even though you never lived here? That same sense of homeland which gives you a right to come home also gives you a claim to a place here. Now you, just like my children, might not be able to determine when Israel should go to war. You might not determine the borders of this country, just like my children don't determine where the construction process of our home. They don't redesign the rooms. The person who lives here gets to shape the room. You could have an opinion if I ask about it, but you're not trying to force me to change. There's certain things that, since this is not your primary home, there's things you don't get to do. But at the same time, Israelis have to ask themselves, what is the symbolic relationship and responsibility they have to you so that you feel comfortable and at home here? How do we have to recognize religious expressions, denominations, feelings? How do we create a space where you could talk, where you could relax, where when you're here, we don't want you to feel the same as when you're on the Cayman Islands. We want you to feel at home here, but it doesn't. There's an etiquette that we have to develop. Our challenge as we move forward, it doesn't do well, and again, I'm going to speak about this much more on Wednesday, to create a dichotomous language which exacerbates the problem that we in fact have. We have enough problems, we don't have to make them worse. It's not that Israelis don't care about you. It's just they have no narrative to understand you. But within a Zionist narrative, can we expand the parameters of what a homeland means? Not a homeland as one home in which all Jews should live, but one of, maybe even the central home of a Jewish people, that all people have a claim to, even if they don't make Aliyah. That's why the Kotel was so significant, because it was more symbolic. How do Israelis create a symbolic sense of relationship, of being seen, of being respected? Now, it's true, Israelis want to think that they're the parent. It's true. Maybe that's one of the deep flaws. In the short run, that's not going to change. One of the interesting things is more and more North American Jews feel that they're the parent. Wouldn't this be a great family? I know it's complicated because we're a family, but no one admits who's the parent and who's the child. That's something we're going to have to work on. Should maybe we get rid of the parent-child model? Should there be a notion of brothers and sisters? But if there's brothers and sisters, how does it exactly work that one of them is in the parent's house? But we don't have to take the narrative too literally. I also don't mind if Israel and world Jewry compete with each other. Who's the parent? Who has the better chance to survive? Who has the better chance to survive? Great, what a competition. Who has a greater message? Who's going to contribute more? That will be a good competition. But leaving that aside, knowing that the example is not perfect, but that deep down, part of what a Jewish people today has to learn is that we don't need an enemy on the outside to remind ourselves that we are family. We don't need an enemy on the outside to remind me that I have to enable you to have a claim or a place in my home. You don't want that type of place. It's a different ballgame. It's a different discussion. But can we still share a home? In fact, can we still share multiple homes? And can we develop a new etiquette in which all of us still feel that we have a place, respected, loved, cared for? Jewish peoplehood is one of the great ideas of the Jewish people, greatest ideas of Judaism. Our challenge now is to give it new categories, new models and new expressions, so that my declaration that on our watch the Jewish people will not walk away from each other will not be a prayer, but actually will be a reality. Thank you.
Forgive me for keeping my kippah in my pocket. I believe in gravity, but there's also wind. One of the most significant symbolic moments that took place for me here a couple years ago working for the Shalom Hartman Institute was in getting a plaque. I run the Hartman Institute in North America, and as a result of that, I spend 10 to 11 months of the year where I live, which is in North America. But here in the summer, I come to Israel, and I come over winter break as well. And the plaque that I got, which is removable the day after I leave, is the plaque that they put outside an office. I didn't get an office. I got a plaque. It would be inefficient to give somebody who's not here 10 months of the year one of the offices in a time when, because of so many people who work at the Institute, we need more office space. But it was an extraordinary moment. It took a couple of years of demonstrating that I was worth the plaque investment. It was an extraordinary moment for me when they bought a plaque so that when I was here, I would have an office. And the reason it was so significant for me is because I have felt, as an example of what Donniel is talking about, like one of the people, and there are fewer and fewer of us, who feel at home in both of these places. I've been looking for it a lot of my life, and a lot of my life journeys of the times that I've spent here, not because I feel that my home over there is fundamentally compromised, not because I think it's a bad place to live, not because I think I'm unfulfilled or incomplete as a Jew, but because I have craved for the possibility of living in both of these great stories of Jewish history. To feel at home in two places at the same time, something that I think we are uniquely gifted with as a possibility in this moment in modern Jewish history. And so that little plaque, that little symbol, gave me a little bit of temporary real estate in this place without having to relinquish or forego the real estate in the other place. Now, I and most of you are unusual and in some ways an endangered species. The mostly North American, I apologize to our South American cohort that's here as well. Well, my comments are directly mostly to Americans from the United States. We're an endangered species, and Canada. We're an endangered species, those of us with deep relationships and deep roots to our homes over there and to this place over here. My children are fifth-generation Americans. All of my grandparents were born in America. I'm the child of an American public servant who was stationed here in Israel, which meant that we were living here temporarily on behalf of the American people. The grandchild of an American war vet who was shot on the battlefields of France as an American, ostensibly in some ways, in a secondary way, defending the Jewish people, but really acting out what it meant to be an American during World War II. And I take for granted, in part because of the amount of time that I spend here, and in part because of the Jewish life that I built there, a comfort and a fluidity in both of these places. That, as you all well know, we are an endangered species. And that experience of being at home in both places is a less common experience. And more often, actually, these two places for many Jews are actually problematically in relationship with one another, as opposed to having a relationship with both in which I feel a deep and fluid kinship in both places, a deep at-homeness. For more and more of the Jewish people, including those here in Israel who Donniel spoke about, and those in America who I'm going to speak about, the other place threatens our sense of our own place. Israel has become more of a site of conflict for American Jews than it has become a site of commonality. In the morning class that I taught just a couple of days ago, I alluded to the fact that the great story of the 20th century for the Jewish people was the story of journey. Mass migrations, refugee crises for the Jewish people, and not obviously just for the Jews of Europe, but Jews for the Middle East as well. The story of a building of a homeland for the Jewish people as something that was imagined for a long time, but in the 20th century became a process that was eminently possible. For the American Jews, the story was still about journey in that the story of assimilation was incomplete. As I said early last week, the project of American Jewry was assimilating into America without any of the expectations of quite how successful it would prove to be. The story of the 20th century for Jews in America was, and for Jews in Europe and Jews in the Middle East and Jews in Israel, was to be outsiders in search of home and homeland. A story of something temporary, in process, in journey towards where we were supposed to be. And increasingly, if that's the story that characterizes Jewish life in the 20th century, it increasingly feels as though the story that will characterize Jewish life in the 21st century is how do we make sense not of being on a journey? Because remember, there is so much of our biblical tradition that is about an unfulfilled journey. Our whole Torah is the story of a people journeying through the wilderness and getting just to the precipice of the promised land, and then Simchas Torah, start again. They never actually get in. The dominant story of our tradition is journey. And the central challenge, it appears, of 21st century Jewry is how to transcend the limitations of a story of journey and start to make sense with a story of arrival, a story of at-homeness. There are a whole set of ramifications for American Jews when we start wrestling with what it means for American Jews to actually be at home. Mostly tonight I'm going to talk about those as relates to Israel, but just to think about how do we as American Jews figure out an ethics and a morality that makes us responsible for America? You have different ethics of statelessness when you see yourselves as only temporarily in a place versus when you actually see yourself as responsible for a place. A whole set of conversations that American Jews are overdue to have about how our influence, affluence, power, and privilege as Americans forces us to rethink our whole place in the American civic, political, and religious climate. Enormous questions for American Jews to ask how arriving and being at home in America obligates us and commands us in ways that most diaspora experiences throughout history never fully allowed us to be. But tonight in particular, I want to struggle with this question of how really becoming at home in America implicates the meaning of Israel for American Jews. If Israel is in fact the homeland of the Jewish people as it imagines itself to be, how do we make sense of that relative to a Judaism of American Jews who by and large have decided not to live here and who also believe that they are living in a home, if not a homeland, that's very far away from here? What are the ethics and the responsibilities that American Jews have towards Israel and have towards Israelis as a result of this story? By and large, if American Jews want to participate in the project of becoming part of the homeland of the Jewish people, by and large, they can do so quite easily. Doesn't mean that Aliyah is that easy, but it means that, as Donniel indicated, you can, in most cases, get citizenship at the airport. So American Jews have to start waking up to recognize that our decision to make ourselves at home in America is an express decision not to be part of the homeland of the Jewish people. And that implicates how we have to treat America, but in turn, it implicates how we have to treat Israel. In the old version of this story, How were American Jews in the 20th century meant to be in relationship with Israel? It was quite easy, because the American Jewish relationship to Israel was predicated on American Jewish precariousness about their own Americanness. I still need a functional crisis narrative. Those of you who have studied here at Hartman before remember that term. I need ultimately a place to run because, as we've learned from every diaspora in history, whatever sense of at-homeness we have now is fundamentally temporary, and so I might as well keep that place open, as Donniel indicated Israelis have always been willing to do. I need to support that project because it is vulnerable and because I am vulnerable. And as by support that project, it's a good insurance policy for when things inevitably, as they always will, go south in this American context. American Jews, as a result, not only supported Israel, but cultivated private institutions for Jews in America, places where we would house our Jewishness because we were not that comfortable being publicly Jewish in the public square. The Zionist poet Yehuda Leib Gordon writes in the middle of the 19th century, his great fantasy for diaspora Jews, even pre the Zionist move, his great fantasy for diaspora Jews is that one day we could be Jewish in private and a human being in the public square. This is the dream of the 20th century American Jew as well. Build private institutions to house your Jewishness and try to be accepted as a human being in the public square. American Jews in the 20th century fundamentally believed of themselves as basically other, and there was enough structural anti-Semitism in America throughout the early and the mid-20th century to reinforce those assumptions. And as a result, the central project for many American Jews throughout the 20th century, even as American Jews were striving to assimilate and be at home in America, but the central project for so many American Jews in the 20th century was to support the project of Jewish peoplehood and the State of Israel, that at least we should guarantee that the Jewish people be at home in Homeland somewhere. Even as we are striving, in part because we didn't fully believe it was possible to fully become at home as Americans, as American Jews strived throughout the 20th century, at least they were going to guarantee that the story of Jewish precariousness, of the inability to craft a place where we are fundamentally at home, was going to be resolved somewhere. And so the central project of American Jewry is in peoplehood, solidarity, philanthropy to the State of Israel, support for Israel's government, and believing with the enthusiasm, almost vicariousness, of the project that's taking place elsewhere, because if the Jewish people are going to be at home, it might as well be over here. American Jews took enormous pride, and many still do, but fewer, in the at-homeness story offered by Israel as oftentimes expressed by Jewish tourism. Many Jews show up here in Israel, especially of older generations, and do feel that sense of, I left home, and I showed up, and now I'm home. The images of kissing the ground or becoming familiar intimately with parts of this country in ways that make you feel like it's not really like a place where you go on vacation. You don't really come on vacation when you come to Israel. You're kind of like you're visiting the relatives, even if you don't have any. Right? You're experiencing a kind of comfort in the public square, enjoying hearing the language of Hebrew. Can you believe they have this in kosher? Right? Those types of expressions of a vicarious excitement of at-homeness that the State of Israel made possible for many American Jews, and through philanthropy as well. Our institution and many others enabled American Jews to have a home here that wasn't a place they actually lived, but a place in which they could put their parents' names or their grandparents' names, to own a little piece of real estate, even if it was a park bench in a public park. Because we should have a little piece of this home, even if we don't actually live there. If it's the at-homeness story of the Jewish people, we want to have a little piece of it. And this is critical, when your story is about you're not fully yourself at home where you are, and you're playing out a vicarious at-homeness somewhere else, how we educated our children about Israel meant only to reinforce that story. The Jewish people are at home in one place, and all we have to do is kind of reinforce the narrative as it currently exists. There's no dichotomy, there's no tension between what Israel is and what your American Jewish identity is. I don't have to ask hard questions in the context of Israel education about what Israel is doing wrong. All I have to do is reinforce and solidify why Israel matters to the Jewish people, By and large, I take for granted that it does, and I'm going to provide as much as I need to provide in context of Israel education to get the second generation to feel what I felt in my own generation. There are two ideological underpinnings of this kind of approach to a relationship with Israel. One, as I indicated, this relies on thinking about your relationship to Israel as vicarious, and as a result, not always real. For many American Jews, the Israel that they needed was one that fulfilled a part of their story and correlated to a piece of identity that enabled us to understand that these two stories were never in tension with each other. One powerful example by the journalist Seth Frantzman, which I've thought about a lot and talked about a lot, is that even very recently, this story of a vicarious Israel as opposed to a real Israel has held sway for many in the Jewish people about their relationship to Israel. The story is as follows. How many American Jews kept track of or remembered or noticed or knew where they were or read a newspaper when Shimon Peres died? You can raise your hand. American Jews took stock of the death of Shimon Peres. It was a big deal for the American Jewish community when Shimon Peres died. Approximately 50,000 Israelis participated in Shimon Peres' funeral procession, a big story for the state of Israel as well. And how many American Jews, take a show of hands, took stock, remember where they were when Ovadia Yosef died? Got a couple of hands? Ovadia Yosef, the head of the creator, probably the most significant halachic decisor of Middle Eastern Jewry since Maimonides. The creator, spiritual leader of the Shas party, an enormously influential cultural and political figure in Israeli history. And according to the statistics that were shared, remember I said 50,000 Israelis went to Peres' funeral? 800,000 Israelis participated in memorial services for Ovadia Yosef, which, if true, is probably exaggerated a little bit, but if true, is the largest single gathering of Jews since the Exodus from Egypt. So what is it, right, if our relationship to Israel represents a vicarious relationship to a version of the story that helps to reinforce our identity, and you can see all the reasons why Shimon Peres matters to liberal Jews, versus a relationship to the Israel that actually is taking place that may not actually support or augment our identity as American Jews, but in some ways challenge it. But there's a second idea that underlies this version of American Jewry in the 20th century that I want to challenge. And that is what I want to call Zionism's great mistake in the middle of the 20th century. In the middle of the 20th century, Zionism transforms itself overnight from one thing to another thing. And in that moment, creates some of the challenges that we now experience as American Jews in being in relationship to Israel. Prior to the creation of Israel, of the state of Israel, Zionism is by definition an exercise of imagination. The Jewish people are in a messy, sometimes pluralistic, and oftentimes antagonistic debate about what the state of Israel might one day look like. That is an exercise of imagination. In 1948, after the creation of the State of Israel, Zionism moves from being a discourse of imagination to a discourse of loyalty. If pre-1948, my job as a Zionist is to be a relationship to a project that has yet to be fulfilled, to fantasize about what the Jewish future is supposed to look like, to imagine the possibilities, socialist, communist, libertarian, capitalist, of what a Jewish state might actually be. For 2,000 years, we longed for what a Jewish state might actually be, and we get to vision and brainstorm what it might actually be about. And not only those who live here get to fantasize for that project, but if this is in fact the project of the Jewish people, Zionism is our collective conversation of imagination. And lo and behold, for a whole variety of perfectly legitimate reasons, the State of Israel constructs itself with specific political and economic and social parameters. This is the version that we actually have. And almost overnight, the American Jewish community, through our institutions, through our education, and the State of Israel itself, changes the meaning of Zionism from a collective conversation of imagination to a collective responsibility of loyalty. Your job as a Zionist now is not to be engaged in imagining what Israel is supposed to be. Your job as a Jew right now is to support the State of Israel as it is. And the difference between supporting a project as it is and engaging oneself in the messy business of trying to imagine what its future is about is, I think, the core challenge that once an American Jewish community becomes at home, it becomes increasingly difficult to figure out why should American Jews be involved in the project of supporting something that is. If the entirety of Zionism is supporting the present tense, current version of a Jewish at-homeness, why would I not spend the bulk of my time focus on an equally important and urgent project of American Jewish at-homeness in America? If Israel ceases to become a collective imaginary project, then Israel education, and we see this happen all the time, sees itself as subordinate to creating loyalty. It sees its job as creating support for the project that it is, and almost by definition, invites hostile criticism from those who feel that they're being coerced to something that they haven't fully signed up for. I was so moved by the Ben Gurion film. It was incredible. There were 3 pieces in particular that I was so taken with in the Ben Gurion film that could be useful instruments for thinking about how to rehabilitate this conversation. One was, and I guess I knew this, but I never heard him speak all that much. I was so taken by Ben Gurion's accented Hebrew. Right? Of course he has an accent in English, but the accented Hebrew was a reminder that he too was an immigrant into this story, and for him, his own Jewish Israeli identity was a work in progress. The second piece I was so moved by was his unrelenting optimism. Right? Remember when Zionism was optimistic? Right? I know this is not quite what it's supposed to be, but it's going to be great. And I guess that's the third piece. Remember when they asked Ben Gurion about the Am Sgula, the chosen people type of thing, and he says, is the state of Israel the fulfillment of the Jewish people's chosenness? And remember his answer? Not yet. Right? So that recognition of we never actually stop in a process of journeying. You never actually stop and believe that when you've actually arrived at home, that the cultivation of imagination and optimism is somehow over. When Zionism shifts for American Jews from being a project of imagination to a project of loyalty, it's going to calcify itself. It will invite opposition, and it will distance itself from all of those people who might ultimately be involved in a project that they feel have them some agency over. They have some capacity to change, to participate in, because it invites them to participate, and instead will signal to them, your job at this point is to merely support the project that is. And in the meantime, as American Jews become at home, this story of loyalty and support for the project has actually run up against so many challenges that we know about that are mitigating against the capacity of American Jews to see themselves as connected to this project. So when American Jews look at Israel, many of them / us, not only don't see a sense of consistency between American Jewish values and the state of Israel, but oftentimes feel a deep inconsistency. And if my job is not to imagine the future, but to accept the present, then I'm going to feel such a deep cognitive dissonance between my values and these values, feel very little sense of agency for how to bridge them, and I might ultimately feel a sense of shame. Shame is one of the least catalyzable tools for actually making change. Anger is useful, shame is distancing. If I've told you through the context of Israel education and support that your entire job is to support this project, that you have no capacity to change it, then the things that are unchanging about it, that might be endemic to it, are ultimately going to be themselves the tools of distancing. American Jews, meantime, also have bigger fish to fry. If you care about the public square, and you've become the vision that even Gordon couldn't have imagined, that you're not just a human being in the public square, but a Jew in the public square in America, then what American Jews are becoming in America is essentially what Israelis already are here, right? Living out our Jewish values in public. And if I don't need to do that vicariously through the state of Israel anymore, then why wouldn't I just try to seek to play out a vision of Jewish values in the world through the great stage that America provides? If I can't do it in Israel, why don't I simply do it in America? Many Jews increasingly simply believe that it's not that Israel angers me, it's that I just don't really need it. one of the hard, vexing pieces of building a relationship with Israel, and this is so much a core of our work in North America, the insistence that in some ways Israel matters and Jewish peoplehood matters, and it's our job to make sure that this breach doesn't get repaired. In some ways, when people are feeling angry and distanced, we call one of our core constituencies at the Hartman Institute in our work in North America the troubled committed. Still there, more troubled than they might have been 10 years ago. When they're still agitated and angry and around the table, I feel we can build relationship. But when someone actually has come to the conclusion that Israel is more trouble than it's worth, that I have the safety and the security of at-homeness as an American Jew and don't need this project, that I have the excitement and the possibility of playing out Jewish values in the public square in America and I don't need this project, and that in some ways I'm not being asked to participate and to cultivate this project. I am no longer being asked to see this as a project of imagination that demands the full resources of the Jewish people. It's no surprise that so many people are engaged in a process of distancing. It seems to me that so much of why Israel mattered to American Jews were for circumstances in the 20th century were circumstances that were largely beyond our control. And as we emerge in the 21st, we are desperate for a narrative of meaning for American Jews that doesn't operate through a crisis narrative, that doesn't tell American Jews that it has to matter, because for many it actually doesn't. And we don't connect American Jews to a false version of this narrative that merely fills some vicarious need that American Jews have, but misrepresents the reality and complexity of what's taking place here. And the only answer I've been able to come up with so far, it's not great yet. I'm happy to get some feedback on it. When I get asked the question of why should American Jews why should American Jews care about Israel? Is that I think Israel is the most interesting thing that ever happened to the Jewish people. Right? That's it. I think it's the most interesting thing that ever happened to the Jewish people. And that part of my answer to Jews, especially younger Jews, is, do you care about the big questions of what it means for Jews to have power? Do you care about questions of what it means to reconcile the Jewish and democratic tradition? Do you care about what it means for the Jewish people to have a place on the world stage like we've never had? Do you care about the gap between this story that for the first time in our history, we're imagining the possibility of real return? I'm not telling you you have to care about Israel because you have to. The truth is, I'm not sure American Jews actually do. We could debate that. But what I do feel passionately and deeply is that it's possible that Israel may offer to American Jews new possibilities in terms of how they understand themselves, their collectives, what it means to be Jewish in the modern world through the framework of the State of Israel. And and I want to recognize, I understand how vulnerable that sounds. Because somebody might say, I don't find it that interesting, in which case we probably have to work harder. Somebody might also say, I think my other stuff is interesting as well. But I feel that when we ask the question, do you want to be engaged in the most interesting project that the Jewish people have ever been engaged in, we are reawakening that sensibility that this project is a work in progress, that it's an exercise of optimism, and fundamentally that it's an exercise of imagination. That's all on the question of Israel for American Jews. But the second piece, and there's all sorts of implications for Israel education, which I'm happy to talk about. What might we would do differently to cultivate imagination as opposed to cultivating loyalty? But then there's the last piece that I want to address, which is not just what it means to relate to Israel, but what it means to relate to Israelis. This is what Donniel is the flip side of Donniel's presentation. Right? What do American Jews think about their relationship to Jewish peoplehood, not just to this concept of the State of Israel that's here, but to the people who live here and any sense of our involvement in the same shared project. And here too, our at-homeness in America obligates us and entitles us to rethink the relationship with Israelis and rethink the relationship to Jewish peoplehood. The entitlement piece I'll do first. What are we entitled to as American Jews here in Israel? I would like, obviously, Israelis to take American Jews and American Jewishness much more seriously than they do presently in understanding us as actual citizens and stakeholders of the places that we live in, and not merely as inevitable aliyahniks. That's a really big shift. I want them to understand that I'm actually there, that American politics matters to me in ways that are not just about who is perceived by Israelis as being good for Israel. Maybe an understanding that how the majority of American Jews and how the majority of Israeli Jews even interpret the sentence of pro-Israel is actually diverging from each other, and that these are different criteria in how we assess who's good for Judaism and Jewish politics in America. I feel entitled to that. When Israelis ask me to understand the complexities and the dynamics of this place, not merely through the prism of my own vicarious assumptions, I feel desperate to ask them for that in return. I want them to understand our Jewishness as Jews. I want them to understand how Israel implicates our presence in the world, how caring about Israel, standing up for Israel, changes who we are fundamentally as American Jews living in America. As part of this, by the way, this is not merely a request I make of Israelis, this is a request I make of Jewish leaders. Part of the reason why parts of the Israeli government are gambling on the fact that they don't need to care about liberal Jewry in America because liberal Jewry is going to disappear in 30 years, according to their assumption, part of the reason they believe it is because they hear it from American Jewish leaders all the time. American Jewish panic about our future has now been listened to. So part of our job, if you want Israelis to see us and take us seriously and to see us as part of the shared project, is to stop geschraying all the time about the disappearance of liberal Jewry in America. They're going to believe you. American Jews, in order to garner self-respect, are going to have a dramatically higher level of self-respect. But then there's the second side of this as well. How are we obligated in this discourse of Jewish peoplehood to approach our relationship to Israel and Israelis differently if we want to stay in relationship as well? And I suppose that what we're going to have to do is find ways to relate to the state of Israel in all of its complexity, even when it doesn't map neatly and cleanly onto our own identities. Being in a relationship with this at-homeness means we're going to have to come to grips with the things that make us uncomfortable as Jews from America and Israel. That actually the things that bother us about the state of Israel will probably not be reconciled in ways that we would design. How do we as American Jews try to understand that the ways in which religious pluralism and democracy and minority rights and all of these things that might get played out successfully on this template in the state of Israel might get played out in ways that are unrecognizable, unfamiliar to us as American Jews, but might still be the fulfillment of the same set of values. It might require of us to recognize that our thinking of ourselves as being at home here is a little bit of a privilege and not totally a right. One of the most powerful things I ever heard in this courtyard was Mohammed Darawshe speaking to a group of rabbis maybe 4 or 5 summers ago. And he said to this group of rabbis, he's a major leader of the Palestinian Arab-Israeli community. And he said to a group of rabbis standing here, an activist for equal rights for Arab Israelis in Israel, he said to them, I am 27th generation in my village. He says, I'm standing in front of you, American rabbis studying here this summer. And many of you feel sometimes at home here, and I'm so happy that you do. But your at-homeness can't compromise my at-homeness. One of our challenges as American Jews is to recognize that the experience of trying to feel at home in America does not mean that we get to feel at home totally and to have all of the benefits of at-homeness if it actually closes off the possibility of actually being good partners and allies to the very vision of Israel that we ultimately want to see. I think we have to figure out a relationship between American Jews and Israeli Jews, as Donniel indicated, that makes possible for the Jewish people to have multiple homes and multiple homelands, not as competitors, not predicating themselves one to the other as vicarious or codependent, but in some ways, and I think this is the big idea, multiple homes for the Jewish people should be an indicator of abundance. Look how unbelievable it is that after so many generations and decades of the Jewish people searching for homeland, we managed to find ourselves at home, not in one place in time, but at 2 places in the exact same time. No shortcuts, fewer rules, and more of a relationship. Thank you. floor is open. Yes.
In terms of psychology for American Jews, you address how Israel plays a role of strength as a role of a confidence builder. I didn't hear any of that in your idea of precariousness, but it's my personal belief that Israel provides a confidence booster, a place of strength for American Jews that definitely crescendo throughout the 20th century.
So the question is about the way in which Israel serves as a source of strength or confidence for American Jews. Look, I think that question in of itself is a dividing line between the Jewish people in America, for whom Jewish ambivalence about power, in part because we haven't had it for much in our history, divides the Jewish people very profoundly between those who see Israel as powerful and therefore feel proud of it, and those Jews who see Israel as powerful and therefore embarrassed by it. I think the great dividing line for the Jewish people on this issue is the '67 war, and the experience of suddenly, I no longer merely need power in order to survive, but I'm now exercising power over others in ways that really are kind of unprecedented as we understand Jewish history, except for maybe going back to the Maccabees. So here too, again, I find the question about Jews in power as thrilling. And here I hearken back, this is some of David Hartman's most famous writings that form some of the intellectual basis of this institute, that the state of Israel provides a place for the Jewish people to test out the quality of our commitments, our ethics, and our ideas, because we actually have a framework in which we can try them. Right? And power is one of those places. Fascinated by the rhetorical questions that Jews ask themselves throughout history, if we were powerful like everybody else, would we be any more moral than any of the other nations of the world? I am fascinated by that question, and I think as a curriculum for Jews to talk about power, wildly open, talking about our comforts and discomforts, about whether the state of Israel's exercise of power makes us proud or makes us embarrassed, is incredibly illuminating, offers tremendous possibility. But I would say descriptively now, it feels to me that it actually divides us more than unites us, because instead of asking that question, we're simply drawing empirical conclusions, right? That we as American Jews either feel a sense of pride about Israel having power, or we feel a sense of shame. Yes?
Which ones? The ones in America or the ones here in Israel?
And what I said to the Federation was that in 2012, Obama's approval rating in Israel was 12%, and non-Orthodox Jews in America voted by almost 85% for Obama, not taking Israel's consideration or thoughts even into the voting pool. It seems that the most recent polls show that somewhere around 80% of the Republican Party supports Israel, while less than 30% of the Democratic Party supports Israel. That's really the elephant in the room, the dividing line between Israel and the way American Jews vote, and support Israel or don't support Israel, and what is really going on in the political realm.
Thank you. I'm going to speak a little more about some of those issues on Wednesday, but I don't believe that's the elephant in the room. I really don't. I think the challenge is, how do we not allow our partisan political divides to destroy the family? But families don't agree. They never do. That's what makes them such a pain. No, you can't. You could pick your friends. You don't pick your family, and then it's just impossible. So it's true. There are, on certain core issues, the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community sees reality very, very differently. On Wednesday, I'm going to look at some of the key components of that. But that's not an elephant. Difference doesn't undermine collective identity. How you relate to difference undermines collective identity. The problem is not that we disagree. The problem, just like you have in the United States, is how do we think about the person who has a different perspective than we do? When we don't have a culture of difference, then difference undermines. But that the Jewish community in Israel and the Jewish community in North America are going to have different perspectives about what's good for Israel. Might have different perspectives about what's good for North America. That's part of, as Yehuda, we're not on a shared journey anymore. We live in different homes. What you see from 6,000 to 10,000 miles away is not the same as what you see from ground zero, both sides of the horizon. And part of our ability to readjust, not to see the other as incomplete, but as two living in strong homes, is how do we begin to respect, how do we begin to understand, and how do we begin to develop narratives that make sense of the fact that we're going to disagree, and that's okay. Disagreement is part of our tradition, and should not be the foundation for our walking away from each other.
I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the large number of Israelis now living in North America. And I know I see the Israelis in North America as maintaining a somewhat separate Israeli identity, but becoming somewhat integrated with American Jews. And I know there's a lot you can say about it, but how does that impact the relationship between Israelis and North American Jews?
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I think it's an unexploited opportunity. What I would say, currently, in what I see in the communities in which we operate, with only a handful of small exceptions, for the most part, the Israeli Jewish community operates outside of the frameworks of American Jewish institutions and therefore functions like a disconnected tribe of American Jewry. I'm not even sure how and whether they show up in population censuses of American Jewry. It is a growing percentage of American Jewry for all sorts of reasons, but it feels unexploited to me. And I oftentimes think about, in trying to figure out what to do with a population like this, where there is in certain circles recognition that the model of Israeliness outside of Israel might not be a strong enough identity to withstand multiple generations, that American assimilation is a steamroller, and that the technologies that Jews have to sustain themselves through assimilation have actually been not just language and a certain amount of culture, but other forms of collective group behavior and religious behavior and others that are much more useful in being able to sustain a minority identity in the presence of a hospitable diaspora environment that allows people to assimilate. So there is like an opening to that of the building more effective bridges between the Israeli Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community in America and the American Jewish community. But as usual, if you want to do something like this, what those who are on the inside of the institutions usually say is, how do we get them to show up to our institutions? That is how people usually talk about getting young people or any version of others. They're not coming, and we basically need them to fill the seats, and therefore let's have them plug in to the institutions as they are. The most effective way to imagine a relationship is for the institutions to say, how can we make space for you to be yourselves and to be co-creators in the context of these institutions to help to advance them? The metaphor so that's, I think, on the American Jewish side. The other thing I'll say is the metaphor here that I think about a lot is in the Babylonian Talmud makes reference to a handful of rabbis who are called the Nechute. Rabbis who would travel between rabbinic centers in the land of Israel and Babylonia and carry the traditions back and forth. And those people wind up being really instrumental to Jewish peoplehood. Because even though the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud never get harmonized, they actually look really different from each other ultimately, they are stitched together by shared traditions that emerge in both places. So it's not just a question of how do we get the Israeli Jews in America to be more connected to the American Jewish institutions. It's also like, how might we imagine them as useful messengers and bridge builders between American Jews and Israelis? They might actually be instruments that the American Jewish community could use more effectively to be a pipeline back to Israeli society to carry the message in translation of what American Jewry is ultimately all about.
Another side of it is that it's really interesting to look at the shifting language of Israelis who live in Israel towards Israelis who don't live in Israel. The language for someone who lives Israel is someone who does what? Who's declining. That's the nice word. Rabin had a much sweeter term. The droplings of blood, of bugs, is what he called Israelis who leave. Nefolet shel nemushot. That used to be the language. And the language of Israel used to be that anybody who leaves is stabbing Israel in its heart because we're not making it. Part of the success of Israel is that we don't see people who are leaving. We don't think in those terms anymore. Israelis who live in North America are no longer betraying Israel. That whole language. We still use the term aliyah and yerida. But by and large, the shift, every Israeli, just like you come visit the cousins, like Israelis, we all have family who live in North America or around the world. And there isn't that language of you've betrayed. So in fact, part of what Israel in its relationship to Israelis who don't live here, it represents the sense of strength, the sense that we're able to, and we in fact see another people going to other countries, and it's not betraying the essence of Israel. But that shift in categories hasn't translated into a new coherent narrative for homeness in North America. But at the same time, Israelis who live in North America have a tremendous amount to teach North American Jews. Jewish peoplehood is alive in Israel. It's a deep part of what it means to be a Jew here. Jewish culture, Jewish language are alive here. If there was a way, see, part of the challenge of Israeli Jewishness is that it thrives here. How do we create actually the synthesis that didn't happen in the past? How does the best of what Israel produces and the best of what North America produces create a learning opportunity to discover new dimensions of what Jewishness can mean? Just like the North Americans who moved to Israel, they've had a remarkable impact on Israeli Jewish life, on its culture, on its medicine, on religious education, on academia. The 150, they brought the best of what American Judaism stands for to this country and have had a huge impact on the culture of this country. How does that happen in reverse? And how do we together learn from each other, not let our differences separate ourselves? How does the Israeli who lives in North America not just integrate into North America, but learn from it and begin to personify maybe new types of syntheses which represent what ultimately Jewish peoplehood should be about, would be a really interesting question to continue to think about in the next decade or so.
I just want to ask raise one other issue on the political front, which is it's very possible to view events of the last year as the Israeli government saying, we really don't care about Reform Jews, we really don't care about American Jews, our future is with the evangelicals that are the Trump supporters, they are the people that really support Israel, we don't care about it.
I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe it's the case. And this way, if you didn't even know, it just doesn't matter. One way, very correct, one possible way of reading, and I use the word I don't believe, I didn't say I don't know. One way of looking at the politics over the last year is Israel saying, we don't care about Reform Jews, we don't care about conservative Jews. Our future could be provided by our relationship with evangelicals, and since we no longer need your support, and it's been replaced, we fundamentally don't care about you. I don't think that's the case. I'll just give you an example. And again, this is the difference between when you read headlines and you actually read the surveys which are behind the headlines. 60% of Israelis say we should not take North American Jews' opinions into account when dealing with issues of religious pluralism and state and religion in Israel. That would seem to represent what you're talking about. 40% of Israelis, however, say we should. Once you factor out the Haredim, that means half of Israelis say that when we deal with various coalition issues, on issues of state and religion, issues that conservative and Reform Judaism care about, we should take you into account. Now that doesn't get put in the headlines because no one's going to read. No one likes the headlines. You know, the Jewish people are actually doing okay. Or each one of us, that we still see each other in some way as part in the AJC, as part of family. When you add it all up, there's something still healthy going on. Now it's true, Israelis say, only 20% of Israelis think you should have an influence on issues of security. From my perspective, 2% of Israelis should think you should impact on whether my son goes to war or not. Frankly, I don't want any of you. I don't want you even. You can have any opinion you want, but it's not an opinion that's relevant to me on whether my kid lives or dies. Sorry, but 20% do. So now there is no doubt that since very often in Israel, given the cycles of politics, 2 years is considered long-term political vision. That over the next couple of years, Israel's strategic needs in the United States under the Trump administration are being carried very strongly by evangelicals and by the Republican Party with its strong support for Israel. But if AIPAC understands this, and it's so self-evident that the long-term security of Israel is based on Israel being a bipartisan issue. It's so self-evident with all our strutting. You know, okay, we are doing trade now with India and they're buying our drones and China's sending tourism and Russia. At the end of the day, go count on Russia, China, and India for the future of the state of Israel. And I want to tell you there's not a single Israeli who thinks we can. And if we can't, it pays for everybody understands that the long-term interest is in developing a strong relationship with world Jewry, in particular with North American Jewry. And so I know there's ups and downs, and right now, and I'm going to talk about some of the hurt feelings more, there's reasons for it. There are real issues that divide us. And in the short term, especially when Israel believed that its greatest existential threat was Iran, and it did not believe that North American Jewry was listening. When it took, now you might say it was mistaken, but under that narrative, they're looking for who could deliver our political returns in the short run. But every statistic says our relationship is in trouble. The notion that it's over and we don't care anymore, I just don't think is the case. Now that doesn't mean that we can maintain a troubled relationship forever. Now we still have a window of opportunity, call it a generation, in Israel and a generation in North America, who let's call each other, we're the troubled committed. Israelis are troubled about what's happening in North America, but still committed. North American Jews are troubled, but still by and large committed. When you're dealing with troubled committed, there's at least a greater chance for improvement. But the Israelis that I know haven't walked away from you yet. They're getting closer, but they haven't walked away yet.
One of the statistics or impacts that connect the future of American Jewry to Israel seems to play out in trips that teenagers and young Jewish adults make to Israel. And you might say, well, it's just a trip. But statistically, people who make that trip connect to Israel. It has a profound impact on them and their future, and a profound impact on connectivity to Israel in the future. I was wondering if you might comment on that.
The question is about trips and what seemed to be that trips to Israel have a profound effect on these issues. That is what the data so far seems to indicate from the research that Birthright has done at Brandeis, a number of studies, longitudinal studies over a number of years. Although it's important to keep in mind that that the program, by its own description, was not designed in order to promote a relationship to Israel. It had much more to do with a relationship to Jewish peoplehood, as expressed through in-marriage as opposed to intermarriage. And in that respect, that has been the primary index that they've been measuring for, that it changes the affinity level of a participant who goes to want to marry another Jew and in that way stay connected to Jewish community and Jewish peoplehood. It's not clear yet, I really don't think the data is clear yet, that those trips dramatically change the nature of a relationship between the person who goes and the state of Israel long term, which is subject to then a lifetime of exposure to complicated media and all of the other tools of distancing, that even if I feel more strongly than I did before about my relationship to the Jewish people, that will a relationship to Israel actually be able to be intact long term? There's another complicating factor to this as well, which is, this is like a little bit of a weird thing, but the longer that somebody stays on a trip to Israel, the more complicated and ambivalent feelings they have about Israel. So this is like the weird paradox of the travel, which is the business is organized around short trips that don't let you see very much. And just as an educator, that feels like a very bad long-term play, right? If your model is, let me expose you to a curated and smaller version of something as opposed to its fuller integrity, what it betrays is you might not have the confidence to be able to hold up the full experience of what you're trying to expose people to. So our response educationally, and this is what I was trying to talk about, is what does an educational strategy look like that doesn't want to use shortcuts? Or that says, maybe a trip is a good starting point. And we do plenty of trips here of participants who encounter the full complexity of what this place is all about. But never believe that the trip is the totality of what it means to build a deep educational relationship with something complicated. Because if you do, you set yourself up for the inevitability that some percentage of the people who come on this trip will say, after a while, you misrepresented this to me. You were dishonest to me. And when that happens, the pushback and the rejection is much more severe and legitimately earned than had you never brought somebody into relationship with something to begin with.
And on the reverse side, again, I don't mean to knock anybody, even though I will, because I don't mean to. Oh, birthright works. Great. What's the solution to the other problem? Reverse birthright. Here it is. Jewish genius and imagination is exhausted by the term trips. Trips, we're going to do trips. Without doing analysis, here when you're taking a trip for 10 days to Israel, you're experiencing a totality of Israeli Jewish collective life. When you take a 7 to 10 day trip to North America, you're not experiencing the totality, you're experiencing America, you're not experiencing the totality of the American Jewish experience. You don't have that because it's not the same community. And part of the attraction of the trip is going to, it depends where. If you're going to San Francisco, you want to go to the Golden State basketball game. If you're going to Boston, it's going to be to a Celtics game. You're going to go to a basketball game, you're going to go shopping. Okay, and in the middle, I go to BJ, and I go to this synagogue, and I go here, and I meet this. But at the end of the day, the nature of the trip doesn't change the conceptual language. And if in the conceptual language, Israelis see you as Shoah, see you as either facing imminent destruction as a result of anti-Semitism, or a silent Holocaust as a result of assimilation and intermarriage, all the trips, the only one, actually in Israel, it's the reverse. The longer Israelis spend in North America, the greater respect they have for North American Judaism. So for example, the Shinshinim, the Sochnut people who go for a year, are some of the best Israelis who come back. They're a gift to Israelis. Says every single person that the Sochnut sends to you to save you a little bit ends up being like a year. People who come for 2 years, they're the ones who become some of your best advocates. But it's not, we have to go beyond. Trips are good, but somehow I think Judaism has some more things, more weapons that we might want to use at our disposal and not get stuck only in that model.
So, great. So the language of experiment, I definitely do not mean to convey a kind of coarseness or irrelevance. I use the language of experiment or project because I'm actually trying to connote that this is unfinished and that it is shaping us and it is shaping others and that it has enormous consequences and we don't totally know what all of it means yet. That's why I use this language of the experimental or the project. I sometimes get that pushback in that context or others of like calling it a project dehumanizes that there are people here. No, I'm not convinced that it does. What it does, what I'm trying to do is to rehabilitate the sense that this is a work in progress and that it actually demands the involvement, the engagement, the passion of not just those who are here to try to seek reconciliation and try to improve it, but also the involvement of others. I do want American Jews deeply engaged in this project. I think the only way in which American Jews get deeply engaged in this project is if they are told, you might have a role to play in this. The more passionate you are, the more engaged with it, you might be able to play a role in this. And I think, and I'm certain, and I see it happen, that the more that you tell somebody you can't have a role in this, or you are meant to suspend your involvement and engagement at the doorstep of loyalty, or that you have to demonstrate your love for something before you can criticize it, all of those blockages actually tell people, ultimately, this is not yours. And here I think you and I have a disagreement on your 20%, 2%. I have no interest in making a life and death decision about how someone else is supposed to go to the army or not go to the army. But I do think that the questions of security are essential to this project of what the State of Israel is about. And I deeply want the voices of diaspora Jewry to matter in that conversation because I think there's a window that diaspora Jews by definition are going to see that Israelis don't see. There are moral implications that come out of the conflict that affect the Jewish people worldwide. And there are things that American Jews might be able to bring to this process that the parties themselves cannot do. So I want, to your question, I want American Jews deeply involved in this, and the only way I see rhetorically to engage American Jews in this project is for them to feel that it is a project that is unfinished and in which they have some sense of agency.
Actually, we don't disagree.
We can, it's okay.
I know we can, but on this one we don't. Because, again, I want to use the analysis, and I'm not saying you're the children, but part of the interesting dynamic as your children get older is how do you tell them what to do without telling them what to do? Like, you can't tell your kids what to do anymore, but you care. You're only as happy as your least happy child. Your life, they own your heart forever. But that doesn't mean you get to tell them. On the most important decisions, I don't get to tell them. Now, here I want to go back to, anybody who studied at the Hartman Institute over the years has heard me, but for those of you who haven't, I just want to teach what Sidney Morgenbesser taught me in the 1980s. When Sidney Morgenbesser, one of the greatest philosophers in the 20th century, was here at a philosophy conference, it was in the midst of the first Intifada, he said the following words, and I ask you to please remember them exactly. He says, I think Israel should get out of the West Bank. All the Israelis jumped on him, and you have to realize this is pre-Oslo. There was nothing. How dare you tell us what to do? Your life is not on the line. And Sidney Morgenbesser, in his remarkable style, said, excuse me, I apologize. I don't think you heard me. What were the words I said? I said, I think you should leave the West Bank. I wasn't telling you what to do. I was telling you what I think. I want North American Jews to have an opinion. I want them to tell me what they think. But just like with my children, and again, you could I could get insulted, etc. But when you share what you think on certain issues such as state and religion, kotel, etc., I don't think you should. I think you have a direct stake, and it's not just a question of sharing what you think. On other issues, I think some recognition of the different situation we're in should lead to a distinction between sharing what you think and you can even tell me what to do, but trying to coerce me into doing what it is that you think I should do. There are lines and gradations there which I still believe leave a lot of room for caring, for learning, for Israel as the unfinished. Of course, power is something that we all have to learn from. But there's a difference between learning from it, having a definite opinion about it, even advocating for it, and trying to determine from 6,000 to 10,000 miles away a policy, the consequence of which is not necessarily going to be borne by you to the same degree. I know and again, I take this upon myself in the reverse. I'm an American citizen. I pay taxes in America. America and Israel are one of the few countries in the world that tax worldwide income. I pay 100% of taxes to the United States. But I don't vote in the United States. I have a right to, but I don't. I think a person should vote in one country. I don't think voting is not just a right, there's a responsibility. And so there was a sense, I don't want to vote and determine, even though I pay taxes, I don't want to, there is a recognition of these multiple homes that I have a primary residence and I have another residence. I also feel at home in America. I love America and I love Canada. I love being there. But it's not the same. And somewhere in the discussion that allows for some complexity about this is what I'm looking for.
So I'm going to take one last question and then we're going to wrap up. Go ahead, sir.
For you, Yehuda, you spend a lot of time in the States and Canada. I'd like your opinion on the campus difficulties American Jews highly correlated with, for instance, justice for Palestine, Black Lives Matter. The statement that Israel has the duty for Am Yisrael to protect Jews. What is Israel doing? What are Israelis doing to cooperate with American institutions to deal with that very, very difficult?
Great. So I'm going to answer very briefly to a question that needs a lot more time. We spend a lot of time in our work with college students, some of whom are here, some of whom study here over winter break, Hillel professionals who study at the Institute. One of our hypotheses in our work is that there are totally different conversations that need to happen. One is the political advocacy question of where and when are there enemies to the state of Israel and the Jewish people in the form of organized movements and other organizations that demand political advocacy strategies, and where there is a totally different problem that is oftentimes conflated with that problem, which is not about political advocacy strategies, but about educational strategies. That overwhelmingly, one of the things we see and know, and it's different, the calculus is different on different campuses, but there are vastly more Jews who are either disengaged or disinterested with the meaning of the state of Israel and the questions of Jewish peoplehood in their lives, vastly more than are engaged in the hostilities, pro or con, around the climate of Israel on campus. So one of the core questions in our work is, what does it mean to actually advance an educational strategy that's not the same as an advocacy strategy, right? There are all sorts of organizations in America and Israel that think of the problem as essentially, that look at every problem and turn it into a political problem. And to recognize that when that happens, it sometimes also amplifies that reality to be much more dramatic than it actually is. Part of what we're trying to put on the table here, just as one statistic, Jewish media's coverage of the BDS movement is 400 to 1 than any other media coverage. So there's a whole thing there about what we identify as being a significant threat and how we sometimes amplify it when the majority of college students on college campuses are not incredibly sympathetic to Israel or incredibly hostile to Israel, but actually somewhere in the loose middle. So I think, it's fodder for a much longer conversation, but a lot of what I was trying to put on the table tonight in terms of a vision for Israel education and is to disconnect a little bit from the question of pure political strategy to respond to some of these challenges and to ask more core, more foundational questions of what it might look like to advance a vision in which the questions around Israel matter to us as American Jews, where we're maybe a little bit more agnostic about what the political strategies look like, and that might be a really interesting vehicle to build this bridge up once again. Thank you, everybody. Laila Tov.